I do not believe that the support of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters can be treated as the passage of a budget. I suppose if the budget doesn't get passed on time again this year, there will be inevitably another extension of a month or two. But the Contras, the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, are people, living, breathing young men and women who have had to suffer a desperate struggle for liberty with sporadic and confusing support from the United States of America.
The Security Council is set up to guarantee peace by force, if necessary. If the Big Five, Britain, China, France, Russia, and the United States, and 2 of the 6 other nations on this council decide that a country is hell-bent for trouble, they step in and say, look, either you settle this peacefully, or we'll settle it for you. Thousands of years, practically since the world began, we've had peace and war. Peace and war. We marked out boundaries and went to war to change them. We developed trade and fought over it. We invented machines and put guns on them. And every time peace got its feet on the ground, another war blew the hell out of it. Today, we have another chance for peace. Maybe the last chance. Well, what have we done about it?
The aftermath of the Second World War brought about a new era for the entire world. Colonial empires were on the decline, and in its place, the rise of new superpowers, namely that of the United States and the Soviet Union. The former allies now turned fierce competitors in a new style of warfare, simply known as the Cold War. Propaganda, espionage, subversion, and proxy wars became the new approach and eventually led to a nuclear arms race. Europe was divided into a Western Bloc, otherwise known as the Capitalist Bloc, American Bloc, or NATO Bloc, and the Eastern Bloc, also referred to as the Communist Bloc or Soviet Bloc. Once again, the idea of a global body to promote and ensure peace would be discussed. The failed League of Nations had dissolved by 1939 after seeing limited success, but on June 12, 1941, representatives from the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Poland, Yugoslavia, and members from the Free France Party participated in a meeting at St. James Palace in London, resulting in the Declaration of St. James Palace, or London Declaration, which pledged assistance against Germany and Italy, and declaring that there would be no peace until the Axis was destroyed. The third principle of this declaration was to establish a willing cooperation of free peoples, a declaration for a post-war order. This was later adopted in September of the same year, after the meeting of the Inter-Allied Council, also held in London, and with cooperation from the Soviet Union. From December 22, 1941 to the 14th of January 1942, a meeting between U.S. and British heads of state and top military officers took place in Washington, D.C., known as the First Washington Conference, or Arcadia Conference, the first military strategy meeting to occur between the two countries only weeks after the United States entered the war. This was to be a secret agreement with a focus on the defeat of Germany as priority number 1. And to accomplish this, the combined chiefs of staff would be the maker of policy for both countries' militaries. The document signed at this conference later became the United Nations Declaration, which would be signed by 47 national governments over the next few years, the basis of what would become the United Nations. In attendance, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Roosevelt's concept of the four powers of the U.S., UK, Soviet Union, and China were the backbone of the declaration, and the next day, 22 other countries signed to show their support. By 1943, the Moscow Conference convened to discuss ways to end the war with Germany, and a creation of the European Advisory Commission was included to represent interests of Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Fascism was now the enemy, and destroying it in Italy was the goal, along with banning fascists from all involvement in public life. Next came the Tehran Conference, involving Joseph Stalin, President Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. The Dumbarton Oaks Conference from September to October of 1944. The Conference at Yalta, or Argonaut Conference, in February of 45, which famously excluded French Chair Charles de Gaulle. On the 25th of April 1945, the UN Conference on International Organization opened in San Francisco, California, attended by 50 governments and numerous NGOs.
Most countries can settle their disputes peacefully, because all the other countries of the world will insist on peaceful settlement. But suppose a country doesn't want to play ball. Suppose it starts arming, making threats. Then the United Nations has a powerful last resort. The Security Council is set up to guarantee peace by force, if necessary. If the Big Five, Britain, China, France, Russia, and the United States, and 2 of the 6 other nations on this council decide that a country is hell-bent for trouble, they step in and say, look, either you settle this peacefully, or we'll settle it for you. But if a warning isn't enough, if a country keeps right on making trouble, then the Security Council isolates him, cuts off his trade and communications. And if this doesn't stop him, the Council can shoot the works, calling on the other United Nations for armed force to stop the fight. The United Nations organization is a working plan for peace. 50 nations have decided to put war out of business. This plan may not be perfect. It's still open for improvements. But it is a chance for peace. And up to now, it's the best chance we've ever had.
The UN's mandate was peacekeeping, but peace was far from reach. The US and the USSR were embattled in a Cold War, and over the next few years, the North Korean invasion of South Korea, the Suez Crisis, the Soviets' multiple invasions of Hungary, the partitioning of Palestine, and eventual creation of the State of Israel occurred, with involvement from the peacekeeping organization. The UN is comprised of 6 functioning groups: the General Assembly, the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Secretariat. A number of specialized agencies operate under the UN banner: the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, UNESCO, and UNICEF. The World Health Organization was established on the 7th of April, 1948. The assets were absorbed from the former League of Nations and the French Office of International Public Hygiene and various other health organizations. Much of this was proposed by Chinese diplomat Siming Sid, who was working with Norwegian and Brazilian delegates to create an international health organization, but was failing to pass a resolution. It was Secretary General of the 1945 UN Conference, Alger Hiss, who convinced Sid to draft a declaration rather than propose a resolution, and to change the term international to world, resulting in the overwhelming support and eventual creation of the World Health Organization. Alger Hiss was a gifted young Harvard-trained lawyer who served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and protege of jurist Felix Frankfurter. In 1936, Hiss moved to the State Department, working as an assistant on the Nye Committee, investigating military profiteering during World War I. Hiss was a part of the liberal legal team defending the Agricultural Adjustment Administration during an internal struggle, which led to the 1935 purge of liberals, including Hiss, fellow Phi Beta Kappa member, Jewish labor attorney Lee Pressman, Jewish American Nathan Witt, John Abt, who later defended Chicago communist Claude Lightfoot, on trial for suspicion of belonging to a group attempting to overthrow the government, and the man who was requested for by name by Lee Harvey Oswald during his Dallas police interrogation after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Abt was unavailable at the time. Abt was one of the first attorneys to represent Black Panther and Communist Party member Angela Davis during the 1970 Marin County Courthouse incident, where Davis would be charged as an accomplice to conspiracy, kidnapping, and homicide. Those lawyers and others were part of the Ware Group, named for American communist Harold Ware and run by communist American writer Whittaker Chambers. Other notable members include Jewish American economist Nathaniel Weil, Henry Collins, who served at the American Russian Institute, Hungarian Jewish journalist J. Peters, real name Sandor Goldberger, fabricator of passports, Communist Party organizer, and former member of the governing council of Uncounty in the Hungarian Soviet Republic, led by communist Jewish revolutionary Bela Kun. Additionally involved in the purge, chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Jewish legal scholar Jerome Frank, heading the legal team for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and later one of the judges to review the convictions of Jewish spy duo Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused, convicted, and executed for their role in spying for the Soviet Union by providing top-secret information about American nuclear weapons and related technology.
I first knew him as Crosley. What his name is today, I am not prepared to testify to, or what other names he may have had.
August 3rd, 1948. The Ware Group is under fire from the unlikeliest of candidates, their former leader, and now a former communist, Whittaker Chambers, who denounces the Ware Group as a group attempting to overthrow the government. The purpose of this group, and at that time, was not primarily espionage. Its original purpose was the communist infiltration of the American government, but espionage was certainly one of its eventual objectives. Chambers was now a senior editor at Time magazine and had recently authored a criticism of the conference in Yalta. Present at that conference and main focus of Whittaker, Alger Hiss. Hiss had access to levels of top-secret information that very few had, and the idea that he may be a Soviet spy created extreme problems, both for the public during the heart of the Cold War and on the international stage. Hiss's presence at Yalta could create a serious black eye for the Roosevelt and Truman administration. Their inability to let Hiss go undetected for so long and to obtain such a status within the American government would be nearly impossible to explain away. Hiss's presence at the Potsdam Conference, which led to the formation of the UN, would also now become a major concern, as Hiss could take his sensitive information to nearly any country he needed to. As a new president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace think tank, Hiss had even more resources than before. This position was presented to Hiss by yet another Phi Beta Kappa Society member, Dean Acheson, the man who later became responsible for the China White Paper, examining diplomacy issues between China and the United States. Chambers presented his testimony to Assistant Secretary of State Adolph Burl, claiming misleading testimony that Hiss had passed on state secrets to him for another Soviet official. Corroborating these claims, admitted communist spy Elizabeth Bentley, lover of Bolshevik Jewish spy Jacob Golas, and member of the Silver Master Group, named for Jewish economist and spy ringleader Nathan Silvermaster. Given the recent Gozenko affair, in which Ukrainian cipher clerk and defector Igor Gozenko had exposed Soviet attempts to steal nuclear secrets, essentially triggering the Cold War, Chambers' accusations were taken extremely seriously. It was clear that a Soviet infiltration had occurred. Hiss denied this accusation, knowing Chambers, and even filed a civil suit for slander. But he would later have to admit that he did know Chambers after documents preserved on undeveloped rolls of 35mm film were presented along with a Woodstock typewriter that produced many of the state documents. These accusations against Hiss were growing by the day, and so was the fear for the American public. Senator Joseph McCarthy's claims of communist infiltration in the American government appeared to be true, and the Hiss case did little to calm a fear in the American people's minds. Espionage could be punishable by death, and this fact was not lost on California Representative Richard Nixon, who had decided to pursue Hiss and other New Deal communists. Others thought it was simply a political witch hunt. President Truman seemed both disgusted at the charges against Hiss and at the political theater it was creating, calling the opposition to Hiss a red herring.
Of course Hiss is guilty, but that damn committee isn't interested in that. All it cares about is politics, and as long as they try to make politics out of this communist issue, I'm going to label their activities for what they are, a red herring.
But Richard Nixon disagreed. He was well aware of the communist elements and who was behind much of it.
Jews have been close, but there's just this strange malignancy now that seems to creep among them. I don't know, radicalism. Very interesting thing. So few of those who engage in espionage are Negroes. Very lucky out there. As a matter of fact, very few have become communists. But the Negroes, have you ever noticed? There are damn few Negro spies.
They're not intellectual enough. Not smart enough.
It may be.
Not smart enough to be spies.
The Jews,
intellectual enough.
The Jews are born spies. You know, some of them are just in it, up to their necks.
No, kind of basic deviousness that.
Well, also an arrogance. An arrogance that says that's what makes us funny. He puts himself above the law.
The only two non-Jews in the communist conspiracy were Chambers and Hiss. Many felt that Hiss was. He could have been half, but he was not by religion. The only two non-Jews. Every other one was a Jew, and it raised hell with us. There's a Jewish cabal, you know, running through this, working with people like Burns and the rest, and they only talk to Jews.
Nixon arranged for a meeting between Hiss and Chambers at the New York Commodore Hotel. Hiss stated that Chambers had called himself George Crosley. But Chambers appeared to know too much about Hiss for the men not to have known each other. The infamous pumpkin papers, named for the 35mm film strips which had been stored in a hollowed-out pumpkin at Chambers' residence, were enough to eventually prosecute Hiss, but not for espionage, as the statute of limitation had run out. Hiss would eventually be convicted of perjury and sentenced to 2 years in prison. It wasn't until many years later in 1996, when the Venona decrypts were declassified, that the guilt of Hiss would be proven. Part of the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, pre-NSA, Project Venona. Messages from 1939 onward, detailing a Soviet spy, and meeting with an agent simply named Ailes, and their travels and activities. Ailes was a State Department official who had traveled to Moscow and with President Roosevelt to Yalta in 1945. Only one man could have fit this description, Alger Hiss. The information in the Venona decrypts reveal 4 important cables, revealing identities of multiple Americans who worked as spies for the Soviet Union. The first cable involves a meeting between 2 agents, known as Gus or Goose, and Rest. Rest was German physicist and spy Klaus Emil Fuchs, a man who would be instrumental in the development of early models of the hydrogen bomb. Fuchs was a communist who had gone into hiding after the German Reichstag fire of 1933. He was part of the Manhattan Project's teams at Columbia University and at Los Alamos Laboratory under Jewish theoretical physicist Hans Bethe. Fuchs had helped create the KPD with German Jewish economist and communist Jürgen Kaczynski, and Kaczynski later introduced him to Simon Davidovich Kramer, codename Alexander, and the Red Army's Foreign Military Intelligence Directorate. Fuchs was teamed with Jewish spy Ursula Kaczynski, otherwise known as Ruth Werner, Ursula Hamburger, codename Sonia. She was an experienced spy who had worked with U.S. spy Agnes Smedley and German spy Richard Sorge. Fuchs confessed to passing information to the Soviets for 7 years, mainly courier Harry Gold, a Swiss-born Ukrainian Jewish laboratory chemist, and later witness. in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, an NKGB agent, codename Raymond. At Los Alamos, Fuchs befriended Jewish-American Richard Feynman. The Venona cable regarding Fuchs and gold had been sent by Soviet New York-based Russian chemical engineer and KGB spy Leonid Kvasnikov to Lieutenant General Pavel Mikhailovich Fitton, or Victor, deputy chief of NKVD's Foreign Intelligence Unit and organizer of the Manhattan Project network of spies. The project name? Enormous. Fuchs' confession in January of 1950 led to a 14-year prison sentence, and the FBI to Harry Gold, whose confessions led to multiple arrests. Gold was sentenced to 30 years, but was paroled for good behavior in May of 1965. He later became chief pathologist at the John F. Kennedy Memorial Hospital in Indio, California. The information provided by Fuchs to the Soviets was vital. Comintern knew how much uranium or plutonium would be used in each atomic bomb. Hans Bethe later stated that Fuchs was the only physicist to have truly changed history.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
I don't believe you have the right to ask the question of anybody.
Are you now, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It is perfectly clear to me, gentlemen, that if you continue in this particular fashion, you have only one idea. And that is to cause strife in the industry,
You're excused.
chaos in the industry, and
direct the witness to answer that question.
The second cable was sent on September 21, 1944, a cable that would ultimately implicate Julius and Ethel Rosenberg by way of Ethel's sister-in-law, Ruth Greenglass, born Ruth Leah Prince, Jewish-American spy from New York's Lower East Side and member of the Young Communist League. Ruth married David Greenglass, a Jewish-American machinist, communist, and atomic spy. David was stationed at Clinton Engineer Works, the production installation line of the Manhattan Project, in the town of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This was federal land, developed as a segregated community. In August of 1944, David was transferred to Los Alamos Laboratory. David's sister Ethel had married a young Jewish communist immigrant from Russia named Julius Rosenberg. Rosenberg led the Young Communist League, where David and Ruth met. Julius was expelled from the Army Signal Corps after his Communist Party membership was discovered, but around 1942, he was being courted as a Soviet spy by Jewish spy master Semyon Semyonov, who persuaded Vasily Zarubin, husband of Jewish Soviet spy Elizabeth Zarubina, to transfer Julius Rosenberg from the Communist Party USA to the Residentura, or station spy chief. Semyonov and Zarubina oversaw a massive Jewish immigrant communist network of spies for Project Enormous, or the Manhattan Project. Semyonov received regular reports from Jewish-Italian spy and Soviet nuclear physicist Bruno Pontecorvo, one of the members of the famed Via Panisperna boys, led by Enrico Fermi, who discovered slow neutrons leading to the nuclear reactor. Pontecorvo, Emilio Segre, and Fermi's wife were all Jewish and subject to Italian racial law. Julius Rosenberg was managed by Alexander Feklisov, who was manager of Klaus Fuchs. Thousands of reports from Julius Rosenberg, many regarding artillery fuses, Emerson Radio, which was at the time run by Benjamin Abrams, high-ranking Farragut Lodge 976 Freemason and prolific donor to Jewish organizations like Yeshiva University, the Federation of Jewish Philanthropics, the Weizmann Institute, the United Jewish Appeal, and many more. These artillery fuses were reportedly installed on Soviet anti-aircraft missiles, such as the ones used to bring down the Lockheed U-2 later in 1960. Rosenberg learned of the work of David Greenglass through David's wife, Ruth. The cable suggests the recruitment of Ruth with the intent to later recruit David. Ruth later went by the cover name Osa, or Wasp. David became Caliber, and a November letter from him expressed his interest in working with the community. Klaus Voogt's confession led to Harry Gold, whose confession led to David Greenglass, who also confessed. This confession now implicated Rosenberg, as well as David's wife Ruth, who in turn implicated Ethel. David Greenglass was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but was released in 9.5, reuniting with his wife, who escaped conviction altogether. Greenglass had admitted that Julius Rosenberg passed secrets to Soviet agent Anatoly Yatskov, a Soviet consul in New York. This was the necessary evidence to convict the Rosenbergs, and by July 17, 1950, Julius Rosenberg was arrested on suspicion of espionage. Other conspirators and couriers were now under suspicion. Morton Sobel, Jewish-American immigrant and engineer who worked with General Electric and Reeves Instrument Corporation. He fled to Mexico after the arrest of Greenglass. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of espionage in 1951 and sentenced to 30 years. He served just under 18. Presiding over the Rosenberg case, Jewish U.S. Circuit Judge Irving Kaufman, later nicknamed Pope Kaufman, for his schoolwork at Fordham, a Catholic school. Jewish U.S. Attorney Irving Sapol led the prosecution, the same to prosecute the Alger Hiss case. Representing the Rosenbergs, Emanuel Hirsch Bloch and Marshall Perlin, who also represented Sobel. Bloch claimed that Julius was the first victim of American fascism. Ethel Rosenberg was called to testify before a grand jury and asserted her right not to answer questions. The Rosenbergs were convicted of espionage and sentenced to death under Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917.
I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. And who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country.
Multiple protests sprang up around the world between the time of the trial and execution. The usual cries of anti-Semitism came from the left, but due to the warranted fears of communism, many Jewish groups were hesitant to join the protests. But communists like Jewish-American author Nelson Algren, Weimar-era playwright Bertolt Brecht, Jewish physicist Albert Einstein, artist Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, Pablo Picasso, and more called for the pardon of the Rosenbergs. The situation was considered the American Dreyfus Affair. The All-Black International Longshoremen's Association staged a day protest. Jewish filmmaker and creator of the 1927 film Metropolis, Fritz Lang, joined in a public call for a pardon. Even Pope Pius XII asked to spare the Rosenbergs, but in the end, all appeals would fail. The Rosenbergs were executed on June 19, 1953, by the electric chair. Their children, Michael and Robert, were adopted by communist public school teacher Abel Meeropol. Meeropol wrote the lyrics to the anti-lynching song Strange Fruit, made famous by Billie Holiday. Meeropol had been introduced to the Rosenberg boys by civil rights activist and Freemason W.E.B. Du Bois, from Du Bois' poem The Rosenbergs.
Crucify us, vengeance of God, as we crucify more Jew.
The third cable is from November 12, 1944, one of a series of 8 cables mentioning Theodore Alvin Hall, another Jewish-American physicist and Soviet spy. Like so many other communist agitators, Hall had attended Columbia University. His involvement with the Manhattan Project involved the study of implosion. Russian Jewish student Seville Sachs, or Oldster, worked as a courier from Los Alamos. Hall met with contact Sergei Kurnikov, or Beck, Soviet journalist and KGB agent, who reported to his superior, Stepan Zacharovich, or May. Neither Hall nor Sachs were arrested. Hall went on to work for the Sloan Kettering Institute for Cancer Research. Stepan Zacharovich had made numerous contacts with scholars, scientists, writers, musicians, Hollywood filmmakers, actors, and people in all walks of life as a representative of cover group Soviet Society for Cultural Contacts, or VOK. He later translated Alexander Kuprin's Moloch, the Gambrinus, Emerald and the Garrett Bracelet, and the famed 15th century novel A Voyage Across Three Seas. The fourth Venona cable dealt with Julius Rosenberg's recruitment of Alfred Sarant, codenamed Kios, and his relationship with Ukrainian Jewish spy Joel Bar, both engineers recruited by Jewish Bolshevik Jacob Golas, both released by the U.S. Army Signal Corps for their communist ties. Both joined Western Electric, working on radar. Sarant revealed 17 drawings of the airborne radar system, APQ-17. On July 19, 2 days after the Rosenbergs were arrested, the FBI interviewed Sarant. There was not enough evidence to make an arrest, but Sarant was told to inform the FBI of any travel plans. Sarant told them he would be driving to Long Island. Instead, he went to Mexico, under the protection of the Polish. He crossed to Guatemala, later Casablanca, Spain, Poland, and eventually to Moscow, where he was reunited with Bar by the KGB. Both were given new identities and resettled in Czechoslovakia, developing submarine computer technology. The Venona cables exposed what was a massive communist espionage network operating in the United States. One of the most prolific agent recruiters came from the U.S., General Secretary of the Communist Party of the United States, Earl Browder. Browder served time in prison as a conscientious objector during the First World War. Upon release, he worked for Comintern and the Red International of Labor Unions in China, and even ran for president, twice. During the non-aggression pact between the Soviets and Nazi Germany, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Browder was indicted and convicted for passport fraud and spent another 14 months in prison before being released as a wartime unity gesture. In 1935, an NKVD agent known as Ishkak Akhmerov entered the United States with false papers. He had entered to assist Soviet secret police officer Boris Bazarov with intelligence collection. His wife, communist American spy Helen Lowry, and niece of Earl Browder. Lowry was one of the spies named by Elizabeth Bentley. Browder's sister Marguerite was an operative in Europe. At this time, the main operating network in the U.S. was the Main Intelligence Directorate, or GRU, originally formed as a secret order by Bolshevik Leon Trotsky. The main operation, supplying documents from the Ware Group to the GRU. Hungarian Jewish spy J. Peters, or Sandor Goldberger. His assistant, Earl Browder. Together, they placed operatives throughout the Franklin Roosevelt administration, including Alger Hiss, John Abt, and Lee Pressman, acting as courier Whittaker Chambers. Browder oversaw the actions of Jacob Golas and his girlfriend, Elizabeth Bentley. Their agents included Russian Jewish economist Nathan Silvermaster, leader of the Silvermaster Group, and Lithuanian Jew Harry Dexter White, one of the principal players behind the Morgenthau Plan. Both Silvermaster and White worked at the Department of Treasury. Though Browder was a Kansas-born Methodist, he intermarried Russian Jewish intellectual Raisa Berkman, codename Peasant. Earl's brother William and wife Rose, also intelligence contacts, as was Earl's next wife, Polish-Jewish agent Kitty Harris Browder, Comintern agent. Even the family nanny worked for the KGB. Earl and Raisa raised 3 sons, all mathematicians, Felix, William, and Andrew. Eldest son Felix was a young math prodigy, attending MIT at the age of 16 in 1944 and graduating in 1946. He was instrumental in helping to develop Bell Labs and was awarded the National Medal of Science from President Bill Clinton. Felix married Jewish immigrant Eva Tislewitz from Vienna, also an MIT graduate. Their sons were atomic physicist Dr. Thomas Browder and American-born financier and activist Bill Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, who began his career at the Boston Consulting Group in London before working with MCC under Jewish media mogul and suspected spy Robert Maxwell, father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who along with suspected Mossad agent Jeffrey Epstein was convicted of child sex trafficking to numerous politicians and celebrities. Robert, Ghislaine, and Epstein were all suspected Mossad agents. Bill Browder's first hire at his own investment fund is a former Mossad agent hired for security and manned by Israelis, perhaps arranged through Maxwell. Browder's Hermitage Capital is named for the St. Petersburg Museum, which had precious art sold off by the Soviets in 1930 and 31 to finance the Soviet Republic's 5-year plan. Browder's first investor, Israeli diamond billionaire Benny Steinmetz, once partner of billionaire George Soros. Steinmetz was arrested in 2021 and convicted of forging documents and bribery to gain mining rights in Guinea, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Agnes and Benny Steinmetz Foundation is still involved with at-risk youth. It was Steinmetz who introduced Browder to Lebanese-Brazilian Jewish banker Edmond Safra, founder of the Trade Development Bank and the Republic National Bank of New York. Browder, Steinmetz, and Safra founded Hermitage Capital in 1996, becoming one of the most lucrative investment companies in Russia, and later infamous for their connections with the Magnitsky affair, named for Russian tax advisor Sergei Magnitsky. Magnitsky alleged that large-scale theft occurred from the state by state officials. While representing Hermitage Capital, Hermitage was being accused of tax fraud and evasion by the Russian Interior Ministry.
For instance, we can bring up the Mr. Browder in this particular case. Business associates of Mr. Browder have earned over $1.5 billion in Russia. They never paid any taxes, neither in Russia nor in the United States. And yet the money escaped the country. They were transferred to the United States. They sent huge amount of money, $400 million, as a contribution to the campaign of Hillary Clinton. Well, that's their personal case. It might have been legal, the contribution itself, but the way the money was earned was illegal. So we have a solid reason to believe that some intelligence officers accompanied and guided these transactions. So we have an interest of questioning them. But that could be a first step, and we can also extend it. Options abound, and they all can be found in an appropriate legal framework.
In November of 2005, Bill Browder was expelled from Russia, deemed as a national threat. June 4, 2007, the offices of Firestone Duncan and Hermitage's Moscow office were raided, seizing materials related to Hermitage company Kamaya. Magnitsky claimed the police were using tax fraud as a reason to justify the raid. His testimony implicated police, Russian mafia, tax officials, and multiple bankers. He stated that the materials seized were used to forge a new ownership of Hermitage, claiming that the investment firm owed over $1 billion to shell companies, and that the lawyers hired to represent Hermitage were hired to plead guilty. Hermitage was transferred to Viktor Markelov, based in Tatarstan, who re-registered the subsidiaries of Hermitage. Magnitsky was arrested and imprisoned in Moscow in November 2008, accused of collusion with Hermitage. He died a year later, days before he was to be either released or brought to trial. Human rights organizations like the Moscow Helsinki Group claimed he died as a result of injuries sustained during torture. A formal investigation followed. In June of 2010, the Russian Ministry of Affairs Department for Own Security began investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Artem Kuznetsov, who arranged the confiscation of the Hermitage documents and imprisonment of Magnitsky. Magnitsky had testified that Kuznetsov was involved in theft of funds and that they were wrongfully prosecuting Hermitage. The Americans appeared interested in the case as well. Along with Hermitage Capital's appeal came an appeal from the U.S. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Vladimir Putin contended that Browder had donated nearly $400 million to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, which Browder denied. In 2012, President Barack Obama enacted the Magnitsky Act, intended to punish officials responsible for the deaths of Magnitsky. This act allowed the U.S. government to sanction foreign officials believed to be human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and bar them from entering the U.S. Bill Browder was a public lobbyist for the act, bringing the case to Senators John McCain and Jewish-American lawyer and Senator Ben Cardin, grandson of Russian Jewish immigrants.
Obviously, I support this resolution on rule of law in Russia and the case of Sergei Magnitsky. What happened to him was a horrific crime, but it's also an example, an extreme example to be sure, but an example nonetheless of the pervasive and systemic corruption in the Russian government. To this day, no one, not one person, has ever been held responsible for Sergei's death. This despite the fact that the Russian Human Rights Council, established by the Russian president, found that Sergei's arrest was illegal, that he was denied access to justice, and that his treatment amounted to torture. This resolution correctly notes these disturbing facts. The demand for justice for Sergei is what has mobilized the world in his memory. In the United States, Senator Ben Cardin's leadership and I introduced legislation that would impose an array of penalties on those believed to be responsible for his death.
The European Union would soon adopt similar legislation. Russian officials announced that Browder and Magnitsky would be tried for tax evasion involving Hermitage's acquisition of Russian state-owned energy corporation Gazprom, shares worth $70 million. Browder was convicted in absentia by a district court in Moscow and sentenced to 9 years. Magnitsky, already dead, was posthumously convicted of fraud. Interpol rejected requests from the Russians to locate and arrest Browder, claiming the case was political. But in May of 2018, Browder was arrested in Madrid on a Russian Interpol arrest warrant. He was immediately freed, and Spanish police were warned not to follow. Russia responded with new charges, accusing him of organizing a transnational criminal group. Browder later condemned Putin and Germany's Angela Merkel at the World Economic Forum in May of 2022, saying Putin is 95% to blame for this because he is the one who throws the bombs and murders civilians. The West is also responsible for 5%, and especially Germany, to blame for what is happening in Ukraine. But much of the world would come to know Bill Browder during his 2017 testimony to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee on Russia's alleged interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, involving the Foreign Agents Registration Act and Fusion GPS, commissioning former MI6 staffer Christopher Steele to collect information on ties between Russia and Donald Trump. At the same time, a film titled The Magnitsky Act, Behind the Scenes by Andrei Nekrasov contradicted much of what Browder claimed and made the assertion that Browder was behind the tax rebate fraud, misleading the public about Magnitsky's supposed persecution. One of the promoters of this film, Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya. She hired former Wall Street Journal reporter Chris Cooper to organize the U.S. premiere. In 2016, Veselnitskaya met with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner in hopes of receiving help overturning the Magnitsky Act in exchange for information on Hillary Clinton. Weeks later, the world would hear of an alleged hack and supposed leak of emails from the Democratic National Committee and Clinton campaign, including Clinton's private email server. So are Bill Browder and Sergei Magnitsky simply political targets of Russia and whistleblowers to political corruption? Or is Browder yet another communist spy? The answer may lie in Browder's feelings towards Putin. In a November 15 interview with the Jewish Chronicle, Browder reveals his opinion on the man he says is the enemy of the Jew.
He has got a lot of allies in the far right who are virulently anti-Semitic. Putin is pretty smart about who he should or should not alienate. He knows that. If he alienates Jewish people, he alienates a very powerful group of people around the world.
In the same interview, Browder suggests that he has had meetings with big Hollywood players to turn his book into a film feature. Co-founder of Hermitage Capital, Edmond Safra, comes from a family that has been involved in the gold trade since the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the name Safra means gold in Arabic. The accusations of involvement with criminal organizations have been around for just as long. The Safra family facilitated caravans from Aleppo, Alexandria, Istanbul, and Beirut. But in 1918, during the fall of the Ottoman Empire, resentment towards Jews caused Edmond's father Jacob to move from Aleppo to Beirut, along with a number of Sephardic immigrants who would require Safra's services. Son Edmond grew up in Beirut and was groomed from an early age to learn and manage the family business. By the end of the Second World War, a new state of Israel had been created, and in 1948, the after effects of the Arab-Israeli War would once again result in resentment towards Jews. The Safra family moved to Italy, where Edmond, with help from his father, gained employment at a commodities firm, earning him $40 million, handling transactions between Italian and British gold sovereigns. A few years later, the family moved to Brazil, which had a prolific Jewish community, establishing Safra S.A. in 1955. Edmond Safra was named a drug trafficker since 1957 in the U.S. Bureau of Narcotic Report, and although the original accusation letter was later withdrawn, the Safra family has been linked to money laundering and trafficking, as well as organized crime. The Safra banks focused on deposits as opposed to loans, which could have been attractive to money launderers. From New York Magazine.
Quickly became known on the street as a bank that would send an armored car to pick up large sums from its more secretive customers.
I observed the president to be a leader who cared deeply about people and who believed that the interests of our country were advanced by recognizing that ours is a nation at risk in a dangerous world and acting accordingly. He tried and, in my opinion, succeeded in advancing the cause of world peace by strengthening our country, by acting to restore and sustain democracy throughout the world, and by having the courage to take decisive action when needed.
By the 1980s, Safra and Republic Bank were alleged to be involved in the Iran-Contra affair. The allegation was that Safra was facilitating an arms for hostage scandal, and that he arranged for the murder of a security specialist who was aware of his activities. According to the final Iran-Contra report by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, someone from Safra's Republic National Bank arranged transfers to a network through wire transfers, which were sent to Swiss accounts managed by Oliver North. Some of these payments were considered cash drops, arranged in New York by Safra's officer named Nan Morabia. Morabia struck a deal for immunity and stated that her activities were overseen by Willard Zucker, who was in charge of North's account. These drops would be arranged in New York hotel rooms involving Iranian Jewish businessman Albert Hakim and U.S. Air Force officer and CIA operative Richard Secord. Zucker would wire an equal amount to an account known as Codelis at the Trade Development Bank in Geneva. This account was run by friends of the Morabias, Edgar and Eli Mizrahi. Another payment of $150,000 was delivered in cash to Iran arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, the man who funded Operation Moses, which evacuated 14,000 Ethiopian Jews from Sudan to Israel during the Ethiopian Civil War and famine. Khashoggi was a foreign agent of the U.S., a major donor to the American University in Washington, D.C., and key member in establishing the Safari Club, a covert intelligence network operating in Africa. The club was created during the consolidation of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which laundered money for the Americans and Saudis during the time of CIA Director George H.W. Bush, who holds a personal account. His nephew, Imad Khashoggi, the previous owner of the boat sold to Mossad agent and father of Ghislaine Maxwell, Robert Maxwell. Maxwell died of drowning while cruising on the boat, which was later sold to Rupert Murdoch's wife, Anna. His other nephew, Jamal Khashoggi, was a Saudi journalist and intelligence asset, murdered in 2018, a high-profile story suggesting a lot of foul play, just like Maxwell's mysterious drowning.
Almost a year since it shocked the world, and the story of Jamal Khashoggi's murder is still making headlines. The Sabah newspaper, one of Turkey's biggest, published details of conversations that took place between staff at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and officials in the kingdom's royal court in Riyadh. They corroborate with the narrative that was presented by the United Nations Special Rapporteur investigating the murder of the slain journalist in the findings she published 3 months ago. Further evidence that Khashoggi's killing was not simply a botched attempt by Saudi agents to kidnap him, but in fact a premeditated murder.
The bank that Zucker sent funds to was Safra's Trade Development Bank, which Safra sold to American Express in 1983. Executives from American Express were suspicious about Safra's dealings with the Iran-Contra affair and drug money laundering with the Medellin cocaine cartels. He was also under fire because of his early and close relations with Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky. American Express hired private detectives for Safra, who in turn hired his own investigators, and then sued American Express for defamation. American Express decided to drop the case, and by Safra's request, donated $8 million to the Anti-Defamation League. The media portrayed Safra as a victim, and this contributed to their lack of interest in Walsh's report. Others called the criticism of Safra's dealings anti-Semitism. In December of 1999, Edmond Safra was found dead in his Mexico home. News reports emerged that the suspects were not related to American Express or Colombian drug lords, but Russian mafia. Safra's personal security agent, a former Green Beret named Ted Mayer, was scheduled last minute to work an overnight shift guarding Safra with nurse Vivian Torrente at Safra's Monaco penthouse. Mayer stated that 2 intruders gained access to the apartment and that he sustained stab wounds, fighting them off when he informed Torrente that Safra was in danger. Torrente then took Safra to a secured bathroom, while Mayer lit toilet paper in a trash can to set off a smoke alarm. But Safra and Torrente would not survive the fire created by Mayer, dying of asphyxiation. Mayer later confessed to starting the fire in an effort to be viewed as a hero for attempting to save Safra, cutting himself in the process. Mayer was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was imprisoned for 2 years before the trial even began, further resulting in controversy and speculation. First Republic had shipped billions of dollars of U.S. currency each year to banks in Russia, many rumored to be mafia fronts. Safra was also involved in the complicated sale of holdings to HSBC. 7 accounts belonged to Safra. One of them held $5.3 million. The sale of Republic Bank to HSBC secured only days before Safra's death. An FBI investigation into a possible Russian money laundering operation revealed a crime ring worth around $6 billion. Safra's security was made up of mostly Mossad agents, none of whom were on duty on the night of his death, leading many to believe the Russian mob was responsible. Years later, Mayer said that he had been forced to confess. Safra was buried in Geneva. Attending his funeral, Israel's Foreign Minister, David Levy, United Nations Secretary General, Javier Perez de Cuellar, and Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel. The very same day, the U.S. Federal Reserve approved the sale of Republic to HSBC, resulting in a $2.8 billion profit for his heir, Lily Monteverde, who many had suspected was involved in the planning of Safra's murder. Like Browder, Safra's ties are hard to ignore. Safra's personal advisor, Rabbi Abraham Hecht, a Chabad American Orthodox rabbi, suggested in June of 1995 that halakha, or Jewish law, would allow for the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres over their intent to withdraw from areas of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. He contended that according to the Jewish rabbi Maimonides, some people should be killed before they can perform the deed. Hecht had described Israeli mass murderer Baruch Goldstein as a great holy man. Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated just a few months later. Hecht was placed on a 6-month leave. Safra was not just a follower, but the man who positioned Hecht at the wealthiest synagogue in America, Congregation Sa'ari Zion in Brooklyn, New York. Safra's long-standing relationship with the ADL and B'nai B'rith are, according to EIR's Jeffrey Steinberg, a public relations arm of the Lansky Syndicate and its successor networks. Safra had contributed millions over the years to the ADL, Safra's Republic National Bank of New York and George Soros' Citibank were behind the push to globalize U.S. currency and using information on the trading of the British pound sterling and Italian lira. As a result of this globalization, over $40 billion were sent to Moscow, using banks as front organizations for organized crime involving drug and arms trafficking, white slavery, human organs trafficking, and plutonium sales. Federal officials even defended Safra's operation, saying that it was preferable to government foreign loans. But the Fed also stood to receive a $15 billion profit in interest.
Free thinkers of the world, don't look now, but there's a new addition to the IPOT signature series from Rise Attire. Your based, evil-free ambassadors. IPOT's POP series is 6 chapters deep, so it's time to commemorate with a brand new design. Printed direct to garment on the highest quality cotton tees and hoodies. Untouched by the hands of Chinese slave labor. Get pursuity and intrude the signal with Rise Attire and IPOT, the weapon of choice for a new generation of the info war. In a world saturated with lies, don't just watch. Rise. RiseAttireUSA.com.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I.
Pi is the absolute perfect circle. It's a mathematical discovery that goes back into ancient times, like the Egyptians discovered pi. It's the way energy moves. It is why we were born, we live, and we die. It is ultimate knowledge of the grand unified theory, or others call it the theory of everything. I did not expect it to be that precise. And I think it drove the government nuts because they wanted a list of all my clients worldwide so they could prove I was manipulating the world economy. Not just New York or a market, the whole world. So my lawyer went into court. He says, Your Honor, where's there a statute that says somebody can't manipulate the world economy if he wants to? And the judge laughed. I mean, it's ridiculous. The theory's ridiculous. If it's me manipulating the world, put me in, you shut me up, it should stop, right? It didn't stop. Their idea is that I stand up and I say, sell Russia. And all 25,000 people run out and do exactly what I say, like it's a robot. I mean, this is how these people think, like a French Connection movie or something. I don't really know. It's really bizarre. But human nature is not like that. I mean, I can say something. Doesn't mean everybody in that audience is going to go out and do something. It's crazy.
One man involved with both Browder and Safra has a unique take on the situation. Economic forecaster Martin Armstrong. Armstrong spent 11 years in federal prison for hiding assets and cheating investors. Martin's exceptional aptitude for numbers and forecasting led him to create Princeton Economics International. Armstrong was approached for capital to invest in Hermitage Capital in 1999. He was accused of commingling Japanese funds with other investment funds. Assisting him, Safra's Republic New York Corporation, by producing false account statements. He was indicted and ordered to turn over $15 million in gold and antiquities, including a bust of Julius Caesar. He served a total of 11 years. His views on Safra's death are quite different from the mainstream narrative. According to Armstrong, it began with a plot to blackmail former president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. The idea was to stop him from running for re-election in favor of Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, a Jewish civil engineer and mathematician who gained his fortune from the acquisition of television channel 1. Berezovsky was connected with Safra, an allegedly Jewish media tycoon, Vladimir Guzinsky, founder of the Russian Jewish Congress, and like Berezovsky, a member of the World Economic Forum. This plot required Boris Yeltsin to take $7 billion from IMF funds allotted to the Kremlin. The funds were wired to an unknown Swiss company through Safra's Bank of New York. Similar to Browder's situation, Safra immediately reported the event to federal agents, who announced their investigation at Safra's word. Involved parties threatened to expose the $7 billion theft and Yeltsin in order to appoint Berezovsky as president. Yeltsin turned to a relatively unknown former KGB agent, Vladimir Putin, who allegedly would assist Yeltsin if he appointed Putin instead. Yeltsin resigned weeks after Safra's murder. A few months later, Putin was formally elected. Berezovsky received political asylum in Britain, Kuznetsov in Israel. The $7 billion wired was sent to Swiss engineering and construction company Mabetex, run by Albanian entrepreneur Begje Pakoli, who supposedly had a contract to do refurbishment on the Kremlin. At the sentencing of Bank of New York broker Lucy Edwards, it was only mentioned that the money was a ransom for an unknown Russian businessman. The judge never asked for the identity. Martin Armstrong's trial was halted within days of Safra's murder, moving to conduct a closed court session with no media. Ted Mayer had been sent to prison for Safra's murder, but eventually released with talk of an unfair trial. This left the idea of Safra's so-called intruders unknown. And even if Mayer's story about the intruders were untrue, the explanation for Safra's security having a rare night off is still unanswered. Browder was barred from Russia a few years later and sued for libel by former Russian Interior Minister investigator Pavel Karvov, who Browder alleged was linked to Sergei Magnitsky's death and was barred from entering the U.S. under the Magnitsky Act. Although the case was dropped, HSBC shut down Hermitage Capital. Boris Berezovsky was found dead in March of 2013, at first considered a suicide. Then other fingerprints were found at the scene, and he had a wound found to the back of his head. Thames Valley Police classified the death as unexplained, and chemical specialists were sent to the home. A communication between Martin Armstrong and Bank of New York rep George Wendler revealed that Safra must have known where the missing money was. Armstrong alerted Safra that he would be flying to Geneva, which is why Wendler replied that Safra was going to Monaco for security reasons. If this was true, why would his security be called off? George Wendler was later a part of the Jersey Sting, involving the arrest of 44 people, including 5 rabbis, involving bribery, money laundering, and in one rabbi's case, the trafficking of human kidneys. Armstrong's Princeton Economics was being accused of hiding trading losses from investors in Japan, although the accounts didn't belong to the Japanese. Armstrong states that he met with Republic Bank President Dov Schlein, another Jewish financier who fled to Israel after Safra's murder. Armstrong was asked to bring $10 billion from Japan into the Hermitage Fund. Armstrong declined, even after given the assurance that Yeltsin was to step down and a new successor would be in place. Armstrong sent a letter from the FSA claiming that a $10 billion deposit at Republic occurred on August 18, 1999. This was later corrected, but by this time, the money was already gone. Armstrong believes Safra directed the theft. This was when Armstrong wanted to come to Geneva and was informed that Safra was heading to Monaco for security reasons. Much of this $7 billion that was stolen involved IMF loans from Russia. Martin Armstrong believes that Bill Browder's protege, Robert Maxwell, was possibly killed to protect the club that was manipulating Russian markets, and that after Maxwell's death, his move to Safra was a logical step towards funding Hermitage. Safra's Trade Development Bank was merged with French CBI Bank to create the CBI TBD Union Bank Privé, aligning with longtime friend and business partner, Sephardic Jewish financier Edward de Picciotto, an early hedge fund investor and as prolific of a suspect as Safra and Browder. Lebanese-born Picciotto was head of Union Bankar Privé, specializing in gold and offshore hedge funds. The details of de Picciotto and Safra's merger are not well known, but de Picciotto would become a board member of American Express of Geneva, and American Express had acquired Safra's Trade Development Bank. De Picciotto's partners, Jewish-Italian industrialist and publisher Carlo De Benedetti. Benedetti had been forced to resign from computer manufacturing firm Olivetti Corporation and was under investigation from the Italian government under suspicion for his involvement during the Banco Ambrosiano collapse of the 1980s, when Chairman Roberto Calvi, known as God's banker, was hanged from London's Blackfriars Bridge, suspected to be a Masonic ritual execution due to Calvi's association with Masonic Lodge Propaganda Due. De Picciotto had been implicated in the Swiss Connection, an international drug and money laundering operation involving arms dealers Helmut Reiser and Russian kingpin Grigory Luchansky, operator of the Swiss holding company Nordex Group and manufacturing plant MAC. Luchansky met with then-President Bill Clinton in 1995 at a Democrat Party fundraiser. His Nordex Group was referred to by then CIA Director John Deutsch as an example of an organization associated with Russian criminal activity moving out of Russia. But it is De Picciotto's connection to another group that unravels an even more complicated network of Jewish money laundering, espionage, and destabilization. Private investment Quantum Fund, managing billions of dollars of wealth, including the wealthiest person in Europe, Britain's Queen Elizabeth. This fund is made up of 99 investors, none of whom are American nationals, in order to avoid U.S. securities laws. At the helm is a man who is not even on the board, but serves as official investment advisor, Jewish-Hungarian businessman George Soros, advising through an outside company, Soros Fund Management. Soros is fiercely protected by the Masonic Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. De Picciotto sits on the board of Soros Quantum Fund, as does Rothschild Jewish merchant banker Richard Katz, head of Italia SBA. Neil Taube, Britain's longest-serving hedge fund manager and advisor to Lord Rothschild. Isidore Albertini, owner of the stock brokerage Albertini & Company. Beat Notz of Banca Verm, former head of Banca del Sudeste, Alberto Faglia, whose bank was holding money of various politicians, receiving insider information. It was a haven for organized crime families during the 1980s Pizza Connection heroin ring case.
At one point, after the Dayton peace agreements in Bosnia in 1995, for a considerable period of time, George had given more money to implement the peace agreements than the U.S. government had. He just could move that fast.
In Russia, he pledged $100 million to help scientists who might otherwise have sold their expertise to bidders like Iran or Iraq. In Eastern Europe, he's educated a new generation. And in Ukraine, he spent millions retraining the old Soviet military.
At the center of George Soros, there's an inherent contradiction.
Which is?
Which is, on one hand, you're the capitalist who does not care about the social consequences of his act, and on the other hand, you are a philanthropist who cares only about social consequences. How do you resolve the two?
Recognizing that as a competitor, I've got to compete to win. As a human being, I am concerned about the society in which I live.
Which George Soros am I talking to now? The amoral George Soros or the moral George Soros?
It's one person. It's one person who at one time engages in amoral activities and at the rest of the time tries to be moral.
U.S. State Department officials working on the Soros case believed that over $10 billion passed into the Soros Quantum Fund, thanks to a group of silent investors. Those sources believe that these men include Belgian Jewish commodities trader Mark Rich, famous for his indictment on federal charges, including tax evasion, wire fraud, and racketeering, as well as making oil deals with Iran during the Iran hostage crisis, along with Iranian businessman Asadullah Asghar-Aladi, a Shiite Muslim whose family were Jewish converts. Rich sold oil from Iran to Israel, thanks to aid from Mossad and Ayatollah Khomeini. Rich owned stock in 20th Century Fox, which was frozen upon his indictment and later sold to Australian billionaire Rupert Murdoch. Rich was also well connected with Georgian Israeli Grigory Luchansky of Nordex and other Russian mobsters who participated in the development of the Iridium satellite constellation. He and Orthodox Jewish commodities trader Pincus Green were indicted on 65 counts by then federal prosecutor Rudolph Giuliani, the largest tax evasion case in U.S. history.
Whatever his motivations, no one can accuse him of greed. He's backed away from the day-to-day operation of his businesses and is giving away his billions now with the same determination that he made them in places like Haiti, a country that has less money in the bank than he does. Last month, he brought the First Lady with him for a look at some of the projects his foundation is funding.
Rich was pardoned in January of 2001 by then-President Bill Clinton, a recipient of $100,000 to his wife Hillary's campaign, and a gift of $450,000 to the Clinton Library Foundation. In fact, Rich was a major donor to Israeli foundations and had full support of Israeli officials like Ehud Barak, then Prime Minister, and friend of convicted child trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, Shimon Peres, Ehud Olmert, the ADL's Abraham Foxman, diplomat Shlomo Ben-Ami, foreign Israeli minister Michael Steinhardt, also a hedge fund manager, and Rabbi Irving Greenberg. All came out in support of Rich and urged Clinton for Rich's pardon. This last-minute pardon was investigated by federal prosecutor Mary Jo White, who stepped down mid-investigation to be replaced by lawyer and former FBI Director James Comey. Another silent investor of Soros Quantum Fund, Polish Hasidic Jewish billionaire Shaul Eisenberg, founder of Israeli Corp, Israel's largest holding company, and longtime Mossad asset and arms dealer. Eisenberg's numerous oil and chemical holdings included Zim Integrated Shipping Services, one of the original services involved with the transportation of Jews to Palestine during the Second World War. Eisenberg supplied weapons from Israel to Africa, South America, and later doing business with China, where he died in 1997. Officials in Uzbekistan accused Eisenberg of fraud and corruption and banned him from doing business. He supplied weapons to Cambodia's Khmer Rouge regime and worked as an intelligence asset for Japan in Asia. In Shanghai, Eisenberg, with the help of the Japanese military, funded, formed, and trained Jewish terrorist cells of Irgun and the Shanghai Betar, founded by Polish Zionist Jakob Jabotinsky, to fight for control of Palestine. Members of these units later formed the Likud Party, headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. After the U.S.-funded Long Nol government failed in Cambodia, Eisenberg sold arms from China to Pol Pot, Nol's opposition. Nixon's security advisor and friend of Eisenberg, Henry Kissinger, ordered a CIA coup of Cambodian Prince Norodom Sihanouk, tossing Cambodia into a violent civil war. With Kissinger's blessing, Eisenberg supplied $10 billion in U.S.-Israeli designed weapons, re-exported through Israel to China. To this day, weapons smuggling to Asia by way of Mossad and Zim shipping remains a massive problem. Soros' next silent investor, Israeli Zionist politician and intelligence officer Rafi Eitan. Eitan led the Mossad operation that eventually arrested German official Adolf Eichmann. As a member of the Haganah, Eitan assisted the illegal immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine, killing 2 German Templars in 1946. He earned the name Rafi the Stinker from crawling through sewers to reach a British radar on Mount Carmel in Haifa in order to destroy it and keep it from tracking the ships carrying illegal Jewish passengers. He was promoted to Chief of Coordinations between Shin Bet and Mossad, and led a 2-year operation redirecting arms from Germany meant to be sold to Egypt. In 1968, Eitan, posing as an Israeli chemist working for the Ministry of Defense, visited the U.S. Nuclear Materials and Equipment Corporation, or NUMEC, nuclear fuel plant. Soon after, the plant reported 200 pounds of enriched uranium to be missing, suspected to be on its way to Israel. This was known as the Apollo Affair. In 1984, Eitan was involved in recruiting Jewish naval intelligence analyst Jonathan Pollard to steal intelligence material. Pollard sold state secrets, including an NSA manual describing intelligence gathering tactics. The Israeli government later issued a formal apology. Pollard served 30 years of a life sentence. In the book Gideon's Spies, The Secret History of the Mossad by Gordon Thomas, Eitan is mentioned as being an advisor to British MI6 on counterterrorism operations in Northern Ireland. This led to the IRA putting out orders for his assassination, prompting Eitan to leave Britain. Soros Quantum Realty was partnered by Canadian businessman and Orthodox Jew Paul Reichman. of the famed Reichman family's Olympia and York real estate. In the mid-1980s, Reichman's Canary Wharf Company purchased Gulf Canada Resources, a Canadian petroleum company. The deal offered nearly $300 million in tax breaks, a deal that rightfully angered Canadian citizens. At the same time, the Reichmans were being criticized by Toronto Life magazine, who published a story on Samuel Reichman, the man who aided the Nazi regime with illegal smuggling operations. The family sued and won, forcing the Toronto Life to issue a full retraction. Shortly after this, Reichman partnered with Soros and Jewish investor and one-time CEO of CBS, Lawrence Titch, as well as Jewish hedge fund manager Michael Price. Canary Wharf would later sell a controlling share to Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Al Saud for $1.2 billion. Reichman sat on the board of Canadian media company Hollinger Incorporated, along with Henry Kissinger. In 2002, a French court found George Soros guilty of insider trading. Soros was profiting from insider knowledge of a 1988 takeover of French bank Société Générale. George Soros and two others, Lebanese billionaire and business associate of arms dealers Akram Osseh and Adnan Khashoggi, Samir Trabulsi, and Jean-Charles Naouri, bought stock in Société Générale on the cheap and sold at a much higher price when the takeover had become public. Also implicated in the scandal, Edmond Safra and Robert Maxwell, both now dead of mysterious circumstances. Authorities had planned to question Maxwell when he was found dead, supposedly falling overboard on his yacht, Lady Ghislaine. Many suspected Maxwell was not dead, but fled to Russia. George Pepperot, president of Marceau Investment Bank, was leading the attempt to buy Société Générale shares. The takeover ultimately failed. Brother of George, Michel Pepperot, was CEO of BNP Paribas, a French international banking group whose largest shareholder is Iraqi billionaire Nadri Ochi, the man who helped arm Iraq during the 1980s and who was implicated as a co-conspirator in the Halabja massacre on March 16, 1988, a chemical attack that killed nearly 5,000 Kurdish civilians, the largest chemical attack since World War II. Ouchi was suspected of being Saddam Hussein's arms dealer through his company, General Mediterranean Holding. In June of 2005, then-Senator Barack Obama purchased a mansion on Chicago's South Side. His former fundraiser, Tony Rezko's wife, purchased the plot next door from the same seller. Obama then purchased a parcel of land from Rezko, above market value, less than a month before a wire transfer of $3.5 million was sent to Rezko in Chicago. That money was sent by Nadmi Ouchi. The story was used as political fodder for the Hillary Clinton campaign. Obama returned $150,000 raised by Rezko. Ouchi was convicted in France of corruption charges in 2003. Rezko was brought up on charges of wire fraud, extortion, and money laundering, along with businessman Stuart Levine, who testified that Barack and Michelle Obama attended a reception in honor of Nadmi Ouchi in April of 2004. Obama's campaign denied any recollection of meeting Ouchi, but the Chicago Sun-Times reported that one of their sources had stated that Obama had even made a few toasts. Obama is also connected to Ouchi through Illinois politician Alexei Yamulias, the man who filled Obama's Senate seat, appointed by Rod Blagojevich. Obama endorsed Yanulias, whose family bank loaned $22.7 million to Nadmi Ouchi, just months after Alexei resigned from Broadway Bank. Alexei's brother Demetrius signed on the loan to Ouchi. Silent partner in the deal? Tony Rezko. Ouchi assisted the Saddam regime in buying chemicals that would produce the precursors to mustard gas by directing the Banca Continentale de Luxembourg to help produce the materials. Ouchi's co-conspirator, Majid Hamid Jafar, CEO of Crescent Petroleum, investigated for his role in the Oil for Weapons program to see if his Crescent Petroleum was a front operation for the Saddam Hussein regime. Jafar is a founding shareholder of Dubai-based investment group the Abraj Group. This group appeared to be a similar formation of embattled Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI. involved in their own massive money laundering scheme for Colombian drug cartels and the CIA, and having their assets seized. This operation involved criminal financier Mark Rich, who was close to Saddam Hussein and the UN Oil for Food program. George Soros has been a key figure in destabilizing economies all over the world, but his focus on Russia and Ukraine has put the world near the brink of yet another world war in the hands of international Jewry. Just as the Americans' Operation Paperclip employed numbers of scientists and engineers from Nazi Germany, European and often Jewish scientists, engineers, and spies were utilized all throughout the United States, as illustrated earlier. After the fall of the Soviet Union, George Soros took advantage of the talent pool available, funding Soviet scientists in an effort to further destabilize the region. In addition to the Quantum Fund, Soros set up the International Science Foundation for the former Soviet Union. He drew these scientists with an investment of over $100 million, allowing them to research advanced weapon systems and nuclear technology working out of Russia and Ukraine. This, along with multiple color revolutions that Soros spearheaded, has pitted the USA and NATO against Russia and potentially China. Soros, Browder, Safra, Maxwell, Putin, and the KGB are all connected through the Société Générale situation. But Soros has been working to destabilize the region since the 1980s. According to his own words, Soros' first foundation started in 1987 after political dissident Andrei Sakharov was called out of exile by head of state Mikhail Gorbachev. Sakharov was a Soviet physicist and Nobel Prize laureate who had assisted the Soviet nuclear weapons program until deemed a dissident and sent into exile over his views on the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, along with his wife, Yelena Bronner, daughter of Armenian communist Georgy Alikhanov and Ruth Bronner, a Jewish communist. Her father, Georgy, was executed by the NKVD as part of the Stalinist purge. Soros saw this return from exile as a green light to creating an open sector in the Soviet economy, taking his European shock therapy method that he had employed in Poland and focused on Boris Yeltsin, who replaced Mikhail Gorbachev using his inner circle.
I started mobilizing a group of economists to take to the Soviet Union. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, with whom I had worked in Poland, was ready and eager to participate. He suggested a number of other participants: Romano Prodi from Italy, David Finch, a retired official from the IMF. I wanted to include Stanley Fischer and Jacob Frankel, heads of the World Bank and IMF respectively, Larry Summers from Harvard, and Michael Bruno of the Central Bank of Israel.
This shock therapy led to chaos throughout Russia. A rise in oligarchy, hyperinflation, and confusion left many scientists with no other option than to look for opportunities in the West. The agricultural sector, state-owned, suffered massive cuts. Partner Mark Rich, who had curiously moved into aluminum just a few years before, began buying Russian aluminum on the cheap and turned it around to Western markets who were unable to compete with the price, collapsing the price of aluminum worldwide. His other friend, Jewish billionaire and Mossad asset Shaul Eisenberg, did the same with purchasing of textiles, leading Uzbekistani officials to ban him from doing business there. This same shock therapy was repeated in Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, and Slovenia, and continues to spread, and with it, an army of anti-nationalist journalists to cheer it on. Under the Yeltsin regime, the economy was handed over to Jewish Soviet economist Yegor Gaidar, who was called personally by George Soros. Gaidar appointed Boris Saltykov as Minister of Science and Technology, who took money from Soros to create the International Science Foundation. Soros' gift of $100 million was enough to fund a team of scientists, no longer being funded by the government. This foundation was to be run under 3 organizational bodies, with members being appointed by Soros himself. The Advisory Council, chaired by Jewish geophysicist Frank Press. The second body, called the Temporary Board, was led by Jewish molecular biologist, eugenicist, and early researcher in the field of artificial intelligence, Joshua Lederberg, of the Rockefeller University, which produced Jeffrey Epstein. Lederberg's work on the AI project Dendril is one of the first artificial problem-solving systems for chemists. Also involved in Dendril, Jewish chemist Carl Djerassi, father of Dale Djerassi, who is married to Robert Maxwell's daughter, Isabel, member of the World Economic Forum. Also on the board, Jewish theoretical physicist Sidney Drell, son of Russian Jewish immigrants. Drell served on the board of directors at Los Alamos Laboratory and was a founding member of JASON, the independent group of scientists who advised the U.S. government of matters of science and technology after the development of the Russian Sputnik launch. Herman Feshbach, Jewish-American physicist, MIT professor, and attendee of the famed Shelter Island Conference. Later executive board members feature Jewish-Russian-American microbiologist and activist Alexander Goldfarb from Columbia University. Goldfarb was a friend of Boris Berezovsky and the man responsible for helping Russian defector Alexander Litvinenko escape the country after he accused senior FSB officers of conspiring to assassinate Berezovsky. He was critical of Vladimir Putin and advised British intelligence, claiming that Russian Secret Service staged a series of bombings and other acts of terror in order to install Putin as leader. He also accused Putin of ordering the assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya, murdered in the elevator of her own apartment. In addition to her murder, Litvinenko accused Putin of being a pedophile and that the KGB was aware of it since his school days. He stated that FSB and KGB were connected to all the bloodiest terrorists in the world. He was poisoned in 2006 and died shortly after. Goldfarb's role in helping Litvinenko escape cost him his position with George Soros, and upon Litvinenko's death, Goldfarb read his statement accusing Putin of ordering the poisoning. His father David Goldfarb was a Soviet refusenik, a Jew who was denied permission to emigrate, especially to Israel. A well-known geneticist arriving to the U.S. under a humanitarian parole system to operate on a cancerous lobe on his lung. David Goldfarb had reportedly refused to testify in the case of Nicholas Danilov, American journalist and Moscow correspondent for the U.S. News and World Report, arrested by the KGB and accused of espionage. The incident was the KGB response to the arrest of Soviet physicist Gennady Zakharov, an employee of the United Nations, for revealing documents describing U.S. Air Force jet engines. The Soviets had urged Goldfarb to testify, and his refusal likely resulted in his visa, which was eventually approved, to now be revoked. David Goldfarb arrived in the U.S. on the plane of Jewish-Ukrainian-American businessman Armand Hammer, CEO of Occidental Petroleum and son of Julius Hammer, founding member of the Communist Party USA. He funded the party by laundering proceeds from smuggled diamonds through his company, Allied Drug, a front company used to smuggle Soviet materials to the USA. Son Armand graduated from Columbia College and took over Allied Drug and Chemical. He traveled to the Soviet Union in 1921 and stayed there until 1930, claiming to recoup debts, but was later selling wheat to the then starving Russian citizens during the Holodomor. J. Edgar Hoover suspected Hammer to be a courier for Comintern and had him surveilled for the rest of his life. His great-grandson is actor Armie Hammer, currently involved in a serious sexual abuse and assault case in Los Angeles. Last member of note on Soros board of the International Science Foundation, mathematician, biotech enthusiast, and Soviet agent, Felix Browder, son of Earl Browder and father of Bill Browder.
What up, homies? This is Sir Patrick Mack of In Pursuit of Truth. I want to thank you for watching Acts 1 and 2 of Pop, Episode 6, Communists, Contras, and Cold War. I want you to know that Acts 3 and 4 are already written, but yours truly has to pack up the studio once again and make a big move to what will hopefully be my forever home. So,
Please stay patient with me while I get all of that in order. I know I have not put out a lot of content since the Pop series, but I do hope you'll understand that this has been nearly a 4-year project so far for me, and I hope it's one that will help continue to educate for many years to come. So please download this video, like, subscribe, pass it on. If you want to help me keep these projects free, please consider supporting me at Give, Send, Go. The link is right here. Or you could grab yourself the latest IPOT Signature Series clothing at Rise Attire, all American and handmade. And if you're old school, you're always welcome to send me something at my P.O. Box, which is right here. All of these will be down below in the video description where you're seeing this and or in the comment section. Hope you'll join me on social media at these links right here. And if you have not yet seen the rest of this series, please join me at Rumble, BitChute, Gab, Odyssey, or Pill.net. Thanks again for watching Pop Episode 6. Please subscribe, stay tuned for Acts 3 and 4, and we'll see you real soon.